4 questions to ask, common questions that spiritual directors ask themselves. Hi, I'm Scott McRae, and over the years as I've worked with spiritual direction people, I have had these 4 questions come to the surface the most often. So I thought I would take a short time and address each of them. They're all good questions, and I think there's a lot of richness that can be explored as we go into them. So the 4 questions are, what if I'm not very good at this? This is really a very powerful question that often arises as we are learning this art and craft of spiritual direction. A second question is, what if my sessions are too dull? And often as we do the work, we find that sessions can lag, and so I've got some thoughts about how you might spice it up a bit. What is the difference between therapy and spiritual direction? I've gotten this question a lot. And so I'm going to share some thoughts about this and a couple other forms of care that are offered to people. And then how do I get more clients? This is sort of a perennial issue for spiritual directors, and I just have a few thoughts about this. Often I believe we're asking the wrong question when we ask this question, or we're going to the wrong solution. So first of all, what if I'm not very good at this? And that, of course, is a natural concern that I think we all encounter as we enter this strange world of spiritual guidance and spiritual direction. So one of the things I've discovered for my own practice and have found as I've worked with others is that there often are sort of 4 different phases of development that we go through as we develop a spiritual direction practice. And these aren't necessarily linear, although I think we do tend to grow one on top of the other. But if there's a certain session where things don't go well, we can kind of go back and recycle some of these phases. So I don't want to suggest that these are 4 very distinct phases that once you're done with one, you're done with it forever. I think of the first phase as really the learning and limping phase. This is where we're doing the hard work of dealing with new learning edges. We often feel incompetent. We're coming up against edges of things that we've not discovered before or experienced. And so there's always a learning and a limping phase. And a lot of people kind of bail out at this point. And I really encourage people that have a passion for spiritual direction work to hang in there and get through this phase. And then there's a second phase where it's about digesting and developing. And this is where we're really coming into starting to apply the learning that has come through our training programs. And we're setting up systems, and we're applying different theories and techniques. And so there's a constructive quality to this phase. We're sort of building, in many ways, the substructure of the unique practice that we're going to develop. And we're digesting a lot of new material and trying it out, and some of it stays, some of it goes. But it's very much a development phase. And then this third phase happens, often a year, 2, 3 into a practice, where we really start to claim our voice, and we start to create a unique offering in spiritual direction that is true for us in our uniqueness. And so this work is about claiming how I am different from you. I like to tell spiritual directors that nobody in the world will ever do spiritual direction like you do it, and really give people permission to create a unique approach and offering that is true to the self. Very important phase, and spiritual direction takes on a different kind of level of confidence and comfort as people come into this claiming and creating phase. Then lastly, there's a beautiful phase where we just go with the flow, and I think of this as surrendering and serving. This is where we really surrender into the process, and we're not efforting, but we really are in a deep process of listening and going with our intuitions and instincts, and that whole notion of flow really is a nice way to capture what happens in those periods, in those moments when we really feel like we're in a surrendering place. And ultimately, we all know that spiritual direction is about serving our clients and inviting them into more of the life that they want to live. So these are 4 phases that I think are important to remember, especially as we're early on in the practice and dealing with the limping and the developing and all of that. I always encourage people to hang in there, and often it is our passion for this work that enables us to sort of get through these early phases. But the early phases are just important, as important in some ways as the later ones. And as we're developing this practice, we want to be aware of when we go into that space of I'm not very good at this, it's often our ego that is activated. And ego is always about controlling, protecting, complying. And so we want to just be aware of when we've moved into this quality of experience, of striving, of a lot of efforting, and just recognize in a kind and calm way that there's a lot of ego at stake when we feel this pushing or this striving as spiritual guides. And then also recognize those moments when we really come into our essential self, our true self. And this is a space where we are often feel like we're channeling a voice or an insight. And in this space, as spiritual guides, we feel comfortable risking. We might become more playful. And there is just a general enthusiasm that comes with work that comes out of our essence. And I love that connection of the word enthusiasm, connecting to the Greek in theos, which means in God. So this is a phase or a perspective of spiritual guidance where we really are, in a sense, working with God, working with the divine as we support clients. Now, as we go along and do this work, we all encounter sessions that just don't go well. And so I've had a lot of people ask me about how do you deal with those sessions that just don't feel like they're going very well. And there's often a sense that we take responsibility for that, and some of that is appropriate. So I like to think about being aware of a spectrum of awareness as we do this work. And I think this can give us some clues to how we can spice up and activate a more dynamic kind of client session. So again, as I just mentioned, I think a lot of the time sessions get dull when we're very ego identified. And we're in this space where we may have a lot of fear. Sometimes the ego can get angry, but it's always a space of protection. And when we're in this bottom of the V, as I like to talk about it, our awareness is not very wide. We're really kind of caught in our own emotional process. So being aware of when our ego feels at stake in a session is really an important piece. One of the keys to bringing more energy into a session is simply to become more curious about ourselves, curious about our clients. There's a way in which we open up to the range of our feelings. We become more accepting. You know, I may move into a moment of deep judgment about myself, or maybe I feel deeply annoyed with my client, but I just allow myself to be with that and to be accepting. And it's often in this place that our real self starts to step forward. And there's a different quality of presence when we're in this place. And then at the top of this awareness continuum is, I believe, a very expansive spiritual kind of awareness where we feel like we are being led. We're in that flow state. There's a sense of moving out of judgment and into care and into compassion. We feel more generative, more loving, and we tend to support clients very easily and naturally in this space. So being aware of just where we fall in this continuum of awareness at any given time is an important prelude to understanding why sessions get dull. And the dull sessions tend to be those that reside at the bottom of this awareness continuum, both for us and for the client. And just sort of some shorthand around this, that bottom realm is where we are in reactivity. Our creativity emerges as we move into a more spacious awareness. And then at the spiritual point of awareness, we are identified with inspiration. And so as clients are also undergoing this same journey, if we think about sort of the sources of conversation, of thoughts and responses, when we're at the bottom of the awareness continuum, we are in reactivity. So for example, I was with a client a couple weeks ago, and she all of a sudden got extremely angry with a family member who had done something that really felt unfair to her. And she just suddenly went into that. And I remember my own body just tensing up when she kind of expressed openly all of this anger. It surprised her, it surprised me. And when we're in that kind of reactive space, we're not thinking broadly. We kind of just go with our instincts. So that's that reactive instinctual place that can arise at a session. As we get out of that, then we're often navigating from a space of our subconscious beliefs. So she might have a belief that, for example, that this family member it involved not coming to a graduation party. That a belief is that our family members show up for everything regardless. And so that might have been functioning for her in the midst of that, that might have been underlying that strong reactivity. And then as we move up in the awareness V, I invited her to think about, well, what was most important to you about this graduation experience? And she started to reflect on the people that were there and all the good things that did happen. And so there was a kind of realignment that happened in the midst of the session. And we both started to access this notion of value-based thoughts and responses. And then in those sort of sacred moments of spiritual direction, we're really often able to come into these thoughts that come from out of nowhere, that are inspirational, that provide expansive perspective. And one of those that came forward for this client was, well, I know that it's been a hard time for my sister, and she had an insight about why perhaps she didn't show up to the graduation. And that felt like it kind of came from just sort of an aha moment for her. And so this range of awareness is often something we're navigating up and down throughout a session. And just to be aware of our own reactivity, the session went from sort of intense, and in that was sort of dull, into quite a sacred conversation in the midst of about 5 minutes. So another way to think about conversations that become dull, and I think this is really a helpful framework to think about, is to think about where conversations locate. And one of the frameworks you can use is, are you talking about things that are out of the room as you're with a client, or dynamics that are actually in the room? And I'll be specific in a moment about that. And then you can also look at the time orientation. Are we talking about things in the past or the future, or are we talking about things in the present? So as we look at these quadrants, you can think of 4 different sort of locations of conversations. The first is a conversation that's focused on something that's out of the room in the past or the future. So a client might talk about maybe his job. Maybe I've had a client who's a pastor who was talking about a difficult staff meeting that he had. That's about a past event that's out of the room. And then there are past or future events that are in the room. And this is where a client might reference a previous session that you had together, or might wonder about what are we going to do in our next session together. So it's in the room, past or future. Then there is a location of conversation that happens out of the room, but it's in the present. And this might be, my child is walking home from school right now as we're in the session. So it's out of the room, but it's happening in the here and now. And then the fourth area of location is here and now, feelings, thoughts, sensations that are happening in the room. And the ability to just notice where conversation tends to be happening in a session is a really powerful way of just becoming aware of tendencies within the session. And if we look at sort of the intensity or perhaps the dullness rating for each of these sessions, out of the room, past or future is often the most common area, and it's safe, and yet it often is one that doesn't have a lot of energy. It can really lead to feeling dull. And then there are past or future events that have been in the room. So talking about a past session is a way that often can feel a little more risky, but it has more energy. And so that can be a helpful thing to review a past session or to talk about what we might want to focus on in a future session. So there's really more energy in this quadrant, and it's a good place to take clients if things are feeling kind of dull. And then there is out of the room, but in the present, and this also is safe. We don't tend to talk as much about this. This is probably the quadrant that is least visited in a spiritual direction session. But it is safe because it's out of the room. And then this quadrant of in the room, in the present, is the most risky. It tends to be the least common, and yet it's often the most transformative. And we talk about this as engaging in presence in the here and now. So this might be a time when you say to a client, I noticed that your anger really came up as you talked about your sister, or I notice you're getting quiet as we talk about your future plans for work. It may be talking about, you're sitting there with your arms folded and you seem very tense. So this sort of in the here and now moment often activates and energizes the session. And what I like to reflect on with people who say our sessions tend to be boring is I really encourage people to do more here and now in the room, presence-based spiritual direction. And we throw around this term of presence a lot. And so I like to use this framework that comes from spiritual teacher Thomas Hubel. And he talks about all of us are head, heart, body creatures. And he references presence as that quality of experience that emerges when head, heart, and body are coherent. They're working together. They're not imbalanced. Much of the time, one of these centers of intelligences is functioning to the exclusion of the others. So when we get anxious in a session, for example, we may start spinning in our mind, and we're out of touch with our body, we're out of touch with our emotions. So presence is an activation of a different kind of being with that happens when these three come together. And what's interesting about this is that the divine inspiration, guidance, these we become aware of them, open to them really only when we're in presence. And so sessions that can feel dull often are out of balance with one of these centers of intelligence excluding the others. So this is going on for us, and it's also going on for clients. This dynamic of balancing and imbalancing head, heart, and body. And so if we look at this and think about interacting with our clients, one of the interesting things is, like in the case of my client that got very angry, her emotional center stepped forward powerfully in an activated mind. And that's often the case, that there's sort of a parallel process we talk about, where one of these centers, if it's active for one, can trigger activity in the other. And where this often happens in a spiritual guidance session is two heads trading thoughts. And that is often a recipe for a dull session. So the work for the spiritual guide is to come into presence in those moments. And what can happen in presence, and that's often that here and now perspective that we can invite clients into. When clients and the spiritual guide both come into presence together, this often are the moments where we feel sort of the sacred ground emerge in a session. And we feel like we're being held and guided by God. And it's a powerful thing when two people sitting together both come into head, heart, body presence together. There's nothing dull about these sessions when they hit that sort of that magic moment. So that's covering how we can activate some energy within our sessions. Now, a third question that's often asked is, what's the difference between therapy and spiritual direction? It's a really important question. We have to have boundaries. Spiritual directors are not therapists, and even if somebody's been trained in both dimensions, it's not appropriate to be slipping back and forth between the two. So we have to have clear boundaries. We have to stay in our lanes. And yet, there's so much overlap between the therapeutic and the spiritual direction, because both are involving head, heart, and body in their best forms. So here's how I think some about differentiating different aspects of care. And I start by going back to this awareness V continuum. And when we're at the bottom of the V, we tend to be in sort of a problem-saturated perspective. So we're working with clients around their problems. This is true in spiritual direction. It's true in therapy. As we do work and are able to come into some constructive conversation, we often help clients move into what feels more normal for them. They can move out of the just problem-saturated perspective. They can become more functional. And there's often a sense that there's a creativity and a growth that starts happening as clients move into even more expansive awareness. But then, of course, in spiritual direction, we're really wanting to work with people to come into a more expansive spiritual awareness, more inspired living. And again, in a given session, we can go up and down all four of these, and often do. So if we look at different kinds of caring professions and where they fall in the spectrum, I'm going to speak in very broad brush strokes here, and I want to be clear that any of these forms can really go into any of these dimensions. However, for the most part, therapy tends to function in the problem-saturated realm, and it helps people move toward that more normal and that more creative. Most therapy is not helping clients become more spiritual, although, again, there are some that do. But for the most part, the discipline itself stops short of that. Pastoral care, for those of you who may be chaplains or in ministry, often runs the full range, and it often gets triggered by problems, but it tries to help people come into spiritual awareness and spiritual resources to deal with their problems. And then there's the whole coaching profession, and coaching really sits primarily in this middle range where trying to help people solve problems and move into more creative ways of responding to problems and experiencing personal growth. And it can certainly move into the spiritual, and more coaching as a profession is sort of unapologetically moving into the spiritual realm. But in general, it more sits in this mid-range of the awareness continuum. Spiritual direction is best located, I believe, in this way, where it dips into the problem-saturated, but it's not therapy, so we don't spend a great amount of time there. We try to move people into their normal and creative functioning and into the spiritual resources that they have. And that's one way to tell whether a spiritual direction session is, or approach is well suited for a client. If a client can't get out of the problem-saturated area, then they probably are better suited for therapy. So there's an attachment here that I will put down into the, I'll put a link to this attachment that kind of puts all of this into a different kinds of continuum and scope of practice and motivation and different things. So I'll make this aware, or make this available in the YouTube notes that I have below. And then finally, the fourth question that I have, and is frequently coming from clients or from spiritual direction people, is how do I get more clients? This is a perennial issue for people, and I think it's often one that gets framed with the wrong kind of perspective and the wrong questions. So let's start with, what are the wrong questions to ask? The wrong question to ask is, how can I get people to work with me? And it's a natural question, and yet I think you can hear in it a kind of neediness. There's a way in which it can feel like I'm trying to grasp after people, and it tends to send out an energy that doesn't work well, and it's all based on scarcity and some fear. So this is not the first question to start with in wanting to get more clients. A next question is, will they like me? Again, it's a very natural question. We all do it. We all want to be liked and appreciated. But again, there's that sort of codependent quality and energy in it that is likely to send us down the wrong road as we're seeking more clients. A third question is, will they come back? And we can often worry about that as we have had a session and we're not sure that it went well. And in all of these, there is sort of this needy child that's afraid that I'm not good enough. And I want to normalize this, and yet I also want to say that this is not the material that helps us to get clients. And it's because all of these are emerging out of an ego that's feeling insecure and is feeling a sense of scarcity in this work. So the right questions to ask have a very different kind of quality. And the first right question is, why am I called to this work? Why am I even sitting in this chair or wanting to sit in this chair with somebody in the first place? This really gets at the deeper motivation for doing this work in the first place. And this is really the great place to start as we think about extending our work in a way that might be attractive to clients. Then the second question is, how can I best help this person? And I believe if you really are motivated by this question, it can shape your whole marketing campaign. It's all around, how can I be helpful to this person? And if we worry less about, will they like me, and what do I have to do to get them to come to meet with me, and we instead frame it as, what do I have to offer that people will find helpful? This is a whole different perspective as we think about doing spiritual direction work. And then lastly, staying in touch with what do I believe is possible for people. This is often an exciting thing that we can engage with clients. Often we can see possibilities for them that they can't see for themselves. So I believe this is a really powerful thing to stay in touch with as we work with clients. And hopefully we believe there's a lot possible for every client that we see. And each of these questions really emerges out of essence. It emerges out of our own essence and our sense of being a channel for divine work. And it also speaks to and invites forward the essence of our clients and invites them to bring their best selves forward. So this comes to an end of 4 questions that I often hear spiritual directors articulate, and I hope that your reflections on these have been helpful to you. And I hope that through it all, you can get in touch with that sacred center that is life-giving for you. What we know is this work of spiritual direction is really some of the best work on the planet. And I hope that that this presentation has gotten you in touch with your own deep desire to do this kind of healing work. If you'd like to be in touch with me, I invite you to contact me at this email address, scott@spiritualdirectionlab.com. And I wish you I wish you well in your work, all the best, and thank you for doing the work that you are doing.